Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this ACEVO webinar on legacy income. Very pleased to have you all with us. We've got 9, 10, we're going up by, increasing by the second. So we'll just give everybody a few more minutes to come in if that's okay. But we will be looking to start relatively on time with respect to all you lovely people that have come on time to join us today. Hope you're all well, hope you're okay, hope you're all surviving. The end of the year is nearly here, the holidays are nearly here. Please keep going, everybody, not long to go, and then hope you'll get a relaxing and peaceful time off. Matt and I were just talking about the uncertainty of next year, so I hope you all manage to gather at least a good rest during the holiday season before we start this madness all over again in the new year. So we've now got a significant number with us, and I make it a minute past, so we're going to start if that's okay. So again, morning everybody, I'm Anne Wallace, I'm the head of membership at ACEVO, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today with specific big thanks to Matthew Langdon, who's the CEO of the Institute of Legacy Management. Matt very kindly reached out to us a while ago to see if this would be of interest to our members. And at the time, I was thinking there was a lot of mixed messages coming out about the impact of COVID on legacy management. 1 minute it was that it was going to be one of the, as bad as the rest of fundraising in terms of a massive reduction for organisations. And then the next day it was going to be the saviour of the fundraising, and actually it was going to be increasing, and it was all going to help us to actually deal with the impact of COVID. So really interested to hear from Matthew today, a fantastic credible source on what that impact might be. So Matthew joined ILM as CEO in July 2018 and has many years of experience in fundraising and legacy. He worked as Director of Fundraising at St Paul's Cathedral, as well as for major charities, including Action for Children, the Stroke Association and the British Heart Foundation. So Matt's got a presentation for us, and we're hoping that there'll be time for Q&A afterwards. If you do have any questions, can you please put them in the chat box? But remember to change the drop down to all delegates and attendees and panelists, so everybody can see the questions that you'd like to ask. And I'll come back to them at the end of Matt's presentation, and we'll deal with as many as we can, time permitting. So no further ado, I'll hand over to Matthew and we can talk about the impact of COVID-19 on legacy income. Matt, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, it has been a funny year. We'll put it no higher than that. And one of the things I'll show you is how our the planning and our assumptions have changed over the course of the year, because things were looking quite bad in March, April, May, and have kind of significantly recovered. For those of you who don't know, ILM is the individual membership organisation for legacy professionals. We have 600 members from about 300 charities, including all of the top 100 legacy earning charities. But we also have, as you would expect, significant representation amongst charities that would be classified as very small, but for whom legacy income is a critical income source. So hospices, small local animal charities, universities, and an increasing number of private schools who are becoming big legacy earning recipients. We offer training, about 200 hours of training each year, and obviously advocacy and support for our members. But the big thing that has informed this is that we have an unrivaled network of partners, including law firms, surveyors and forecasting agencies and consultancies, all of whom provide us with market intelligence, which we filter and we make available to our members. And obviously we work with Remember a Charity and the Charity Finance Group, and ACEVO as now, and I am an ACEVO member, and sort of third-party organisations such as the Law Society and Solicitors for the Elderly, to make sure that our members are being represented. So we're looking at 3 questions today: the legal processes behind legacy income and how COVID-19 disrupted them, the underlying factors that affect legacy income and why COVID-19 has been sort of the biggest thing that's ever happened, certainly bigger than the last big thing, which was the 2008-9 recession, which comparatively speaking was quite minor in the end. And what does 2021, and as we'll see, potentially 2022 hold for us all? So the first thing to look at, and all graphs and pictographs and infographics and all of that sort of thing have come from the consultancy organization Legacy Foresight, who are brilliant and have kindly given us permission to use their graphs. And you can see here, this is the normal process by which between death and a charity being notified of a legacy. And as you can see, the biggest gap, generally speaking, is between death and the application for probate being submitted. And there are two factors to this. One is the ease or difficulty for the solicitor or the executor in pulling together all the required information, checking the property, doing all of that sort of stuff. But the other is how long it takes to receive clearance from HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, for IHT. And that has been much more heavily disrupted than the probate process itself. And in fairness, the probate registry have staged a bit of a recovery, but HMRC have in no sense recovered, and it is taking, particularly for large estates, it is taking a very long time to get inheritance tax clearance. And the rule of thumb is that the bigger the estate, the longer HMRC take to give clearance in any case. If your estate is below about £150,000, clearance will come back very quickly. It's all very straightforward. If you are at or over the inheritance tax threshold, they will look very carefully at the estate. And most of those processes are in person in one way or another, whether they are sending a surveyor out to what they call a valuer out to look at a property, or kind of going through the details of the estate quite carefully. And that is taking longer than ever. So now, I mean, now 6 months at a minimum, sometimes 8 months. It's now taking 8 to 12 to 16 weeks sometimes still for grants of probate to come through. So the kind of the delay now between death and a grant of probate being received is now closer to 8 to 10 months at the moment than 6 to 8 months, which is what you would expect. And obviously all of that has a knock-on effect. There have been issues with the probate registry getting wills to SME and Ford, which is still a manual process in that the probate registry put the wills into boxes and they send them over to SME and Ford, and they are then scanned in and read and processed. And for those of you who don't know, SME and Ford are the agency. They read all proven wills, identify gift to charities, and inform subscribing charities that they have been left a notification. And that is run under contract to the probate registry as a safeguard against fraud. That is, it's an established requirement that charities are not in the same position as individuals. The underlying assumption is that most individuals will know that they have or could potentially have been left a gift because they will have a prior relationship with the deceased. It is recognised that charities do not, in most cases, have a prior relationship with the deceased, and therefore the SME and Ford agency operate as a direct safeguard against fraud. So they will then issue a notification to the charity. The executors themselves may well do so. Law Society guidance is that they should do, and most do now. But that bit of the process is sort of, it has been taking SME and Ford slightly closer to 4 weeks to get the notifications out rather than sort of 2 weeks, but that situation is improving and they're fixing that. But it is, as I say, it's the beginning of the process that is taken longer. So we're only now really starting to see wills coming through where probate is where COVID is the cause of death. It's taken 5-6 months, if not longer, really, for those to start to show through. And so the assumption has to be, as we'll look at the number of people who died, that they will start to feed through in sort of in 2021, and it may not be until 2022 that the full effects of that are showing through in income. Although you may have seen this week that RNID have declared their best ever year, And we know that there are at least another couple of charities who, off the back of enhanced legacy income, are going to show the best or the strongest years they've had in quite some time. So we can start to see this, the effects I'm talking about, sort of feeding through. So the things you need to know, just in terms of, post-death, the executors typically are there is what's known as the executor's year, which means that most executors won't distribute an estate until 12 months have elapsed from the date of death. And that is the kind of grace period they're expected to distribute, really 12 to 18 months on from the date of death, which should be 12 months from the grant of probate. That's the underlying assumptions of the system. Obviously, in most cases, the biggest asset and the not necessarily the slowest part, but the key element of the administration is selling the property. And this is why all legacy professionals follow the property market slavishly. The other thing to be aware of is that there are what are known as beneficiary classes. So there are two major classes of gift: pecuniary legacies and residuary legacies. Pecuniary legacies are the ones where you're left a fixed sum of money, say £2,000, and residuary legacies are where you are left a share of the estate. All the value, the bulk of the value is in residuary legacies, but the rules are that nobody is supposed to be paid until in a particular class. So none of the pecuniary legatees should be paid until all of the pecuniary legatees can be paid, and none of the residuary legacies should be paid until all of the residuary legatees can be paid. And by and large, nobody can be paid until the property is sold. Most people die and their property is the bulk of the estate, and the only time that is different is when people have gone into a nursing home and everything's been liquidated in order to pay their nursing home fees. So you should generally allow for about 18 months or so from death to wrap up an estate. And because of the delays we've seen, that is getting longer, but that's still the rule of thumb. If someone dies tomorrow, you would expect to see that money come through in the middle of 2022, which is why this is a sort of a long process, and it's never pays to get too excited about what's happening sort of today in terms of numbers, although it's always worth monitoring. The big thing, and you all have noticed this, in the period of from sort of March through till June, the entire system broke down. And by that, I mean solicitors all transitioned to working from home. Many of them were not set up for working from home. They struggled to deal with processes. They were all required to switch. The legal profession was required to switch over entirely to online processes to put probate applications in. Many were not able to do that and really struggled. The probate registry in turn struggled significantly with this transition. They had major problems with COVID outbreaks at their two centres, one of which was in Leicester and was massively disrupted, which caused significant problems. The system recovered over the summer and into the autumn, but has never really kept up with or caught up with the additional volume of work caused by COVID. And there is a backlog of about 29,000 grants of probate, which are still sat in the system. Now, those aren't obviously the grants of probate from back in March. What happens is that each week a number of applications are received and a number of applications are processed. And it just means that each week they're not getting quite as many out of the doors as they got in. And consequently, there is just an ongoing rolling backlog, which they've started to put dents into now, but which won't be fully clear probably until the middle of next year, depending on what goes on. And to give you some context, 29,000 grants of probate, 4,350 of those wills would have at least one charitable gift. The average charitable will has 3 gifts, 3.3 gifts in fact. So that is about 14,000 charitable legacies that at any given time have been in the probate system and not able to be distributed. And as I'm sure you can imagine, that's quite a lot of money and quite a difficult situation. And what we've got here is a graph showing on a week-by-week basis, in blue, the number of applications received, and in orange, the number of grants that were being issued. And what you can see clearly is that although in April, the number of applications dropped significantly, but the probate registry were broadly able to keep their services running, since really sort of the end of April and the beginning of May, in most weeks, the number of applications received has exceeded the number of grants issued. And that's where the backlog comes from. And you can see that in October, they started to get a bit of a grip on it. November and December will look better. But basically, from the beginning of March, the probate registry just have not been able to process as many grants going out as have been coming in. And that is straightforwardly, that's where the backlog comes from. If people ask you about it, that is what that means. Slightly less jaggly is the monthly total. So you can see April, kind of the number of applications dropped quite significantly. You can see the recovery in the legal profession, so that in May, 25,000, which is probably a record for the number ever received, and in August it came closer, 27,000. But May, June, July and August, month on month, the number of applications received was significantly higher than the number of grants issued. And the situation has kind of stabilized now, but unless the probate registries can maintain for the next 3 to 4 months, can maintain a position whereby they process more grants each week and each month than are received, that backlog is just not sort of shifting. Now, they have undertaken to do that. They have undertaken, their goal is to clear the backlog by about 1,000 a week. And for the last few weeks, they have been managing that. But obviously that is entirely dependent on no further outbreaks of COVID affecting their operation and the ability of their systems to cope. And as you will see, everybody involved in this system, ILM, the probate registry, the legal profession, under forecast quite significantly for the number of deaths there would be from from COVID. So the underlying drivers of legacy income are the number of deaths, the percentage of people who die with a will, the percentage of wills that contain a gift to charity, but the number one driver is the housing market. So if you look at 2019 as the kind of baseline, 603,000 people died, 240,000 had a will and no surviving spouse. And that's something to remember. When we talk about the number of people who die with a will, people who die with a will and a surviving spouse, most of the time those spouses won't bother to apply for probate because the assets will pass to them automatically. The only time, if you are married and your spouse sadly dies, the only time you would bother applying for a grant of probate is if you had very significant shareholdings or other assets that were difficult to pass just by survivorship, that were vested solely in that person. Businesses, agricultural property, all of those things would require you to get a grant of probate. If your estate consists of a house that you hold as joint tenants and a joint bank account, which is what most people's situations, you wouldn't bother applying for a grant of probate. So when you see that, it's about 80% of the population have a will at death, but only about 39% of people actually put a will through probate, and that's where the difference comes from. Intestacy, true intestacy, is very low, but for most people, they don't bother putting you only bothered going for a grant of probate when the last surviving spouse dies. So of the 240,000 wills, about 36,000 of those wills contain a gift to charity. So about 15% of wills are charitable at the moment. That's rising by about 1% a year and has been for some time. And that leads to 118,000 gifts, and legacy income in 2019 was 3.4 billion. So the average legacy is about £36,000. And I've given you those as a baseline for when we start to talk about what might happen next year. But as we can see, house prices are the single most important driver of legacy income. And you can look here, this is a graph courtesy of Legacy Foresight that just matches the increase in house price, the average house price index back from 1992 and legacy giving. And the two separated in 2004, 2005, 2006, broadly speaking, but certainly since 2008, the legacy income rises in lockstep with the housing market. And if you want a back of an envelope kind of predictor for what's going to happen to legacy income, it's what's going to happen to house prices. And the reason for that is self-evident. For most people, a house is about 70% of their overall estate, if not higher. Most people have a bank account, some savings, and a house. And what happened is that Rishi saved us. The stamp duty land tax exemption staved off a major house price crash, and that rendered, so this was the prediction we were given by Legacy Foresight back in March, April, they pulled this together, and this tracks the housing market. The pre-crisis forecast, you can see there, then some assumptions about the COVID response, but their best guess was that the housing market would either be static or would drop. In fact, the housing market has continued to grow along the line of the pre-crisis forecast by about 2%. And that is what has buoyed legacy income up. But what has disrupted everybody's planning is that the number of deaths is significantly higher than anybody was predicting. And that includes the predictions from the government that the probate registry were using with their planning. And so these are Legacy Foresight, from Legacy Foresight, and they were an indication of what they thought might happen, which is they thought the best guess was potentially 26,000 additional deaths, and that they thought, and their underlying assumption was that COVID would continue through to perhaps the end of next year, but be nowhere near as significant in terms of death rates, and that there would perhaps be 26,000 additional deaths over a 3 to 4 year period. And you can see how this worked. They based it on Italy and what happened in Italy, and the number of deaths that were likely to happen, and so on and so forth. And the thing is, we were miles out. I mean, we were so far out, and no criticism of Legacy Foresight, because they are brilliant and they took the best data possibly available. But they absolutely, ourselves, the probate registry, the legal profession, everybody underestimated just how bad this would get in terms of excess deaths. So you've seen there that we were expecting somewhere between 15 and 26,000 additional deaths. And in fact, 680,000 people have died in 2020. It's the highest annual number since World War I. And, you know, those of you who are more switched on in the audience may remember that there was something going on in World War I that was artificially heightening the death rates. It's about 80,000 people have died prematurely, probably 50,000 of those directly attributable to COVID. But what we're starting to see is very significantly spiked death rates from all causes in the over 75s. And it looks as though the over 75s and the over 70s have been incredibly hardly hit, have been incredibly badly hit by what you might term non-COVID, COVID-related deaths. So deaths from loneliness because people haven't been visited, undiagnosed illnesses, and a whole host of other causes. But it's about 80,000 people have died prematurely over the course of 2020, and that number's still rising and will continue. And those excess deaths will continue to a greater or lesser extent, not just from COVID, but until the lockdown ends. So you look at that, 80,000 deaths. That is about 31,000 additional applications for probate that will show through, which will lead to about 4,680 charitable wills and perhaps 15 to 16,000 additional gifts to charity, which is potentially an additional 550 million in legacy income in 2021. So it's entirely possible. The figure, legacy income peaked in 2019 at 3.4 billion. It's entirely possible that next year it could hit 3.5 billion, 3.6 billion in additional income. But that is entirely dependent on the ability of the probate registry and the legal profession to process these additional grants. And this is why we talked about their planning. The probate registry were not planning on an additional 30,000 applications for probate, nothing like. They were planning on perhaps an additional 10,000. There was already a backlog of about 29,000, which they were planning to clear, but they were not planning to clear, and they were planning to clear that and keep on top of the additional 10,000. So there's now an extra 20,000 that they're going to have to find the resources for somewhere. That depends on the ability of your legacy officers and the legal profession working together to actually process and deal with those estates. And it depends on the housing market. And there are a number of kind of known unknowns. What this may well be, nobody knows. For a long time now, given the age profile of our society, demographers have been predicting that the number of deaths each year would jump quite significantly to perhaps 650, 660,000. Because we are a heavily age-skewed country. We have a lot of elderly people. They will have to, life expectancy is still sort of rising, but it's quite, everybody has to die at some point fundamentally. So it's possible that what has happened is that income has just been brought, income, legacy, death has all just been brought forward. Nobody really knows exactly how many of the additional 80,000 deaths would have happened anyway. Nobody really knows how many of them are truly excess deaths and how many people have been killed by COVID who might otherwise have lived and how many people who've been killed by COVID would probably have died of another cause within this time period. It's very difficult to unpick all of that. But the single biggest unknown is what is going to happen to the housing market. If the housing market somehow survives, then legacy income will hold up. The number one thing to wish for is the continuation of the stamp duty exemption, or at least a very slow tapering off of the stamp duty exemption. Because that will buoy the housing market up, which would be good. It's equally possible that a sudden, if there is a severe downturn, there is no government assistance for the housing market, and suddenly you have the better part of 30,000 properties coming onto the market due to probate sales, it is equally possible that we might see the housing market crash to end them all, in which case legacy income could tank horrifically, and we could be heading into a sustained period where it is really difficult. Now, all properties sell eventually, but the question is how much they sell for and how long that takes. But it's what we don't know is how disrupted the market's going to be. The other thing is we do not know how long it is truly going to take to process all these applications for probate, move them through. If the numbers do increase in the way that has been indicated, it could take 12 months to clear them, in which case a lot of what I'm talking about here will be pushed back into 2022. So we may be talking about 2022 as being the bumper year, and 2021 may be the dog that didn't bark in terms of massively boosted legacy income. So thank you all. A bit of a whistle-stop tour, but please do ask any questions you have about any of this, or if any of it wasn't entirely clear, I'm happy to go back over it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Matthew. I mean, as if next year isn't hard